Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Law Enforcement Crash Report Review Guidelines webinar. We're really excited to have you here. Lieutenant Mike Sonia from the State Police is going to get us started. Welcome, Mike.
Well, thank you, Robin. Good morning, all. Thank you all for joining us in the hectic times that we're in. I'm glad that you can take some time out of the schedule to join us today for this educational webinar. My name is Lieutenant Mike Sonia. I am the unit commander of the traffic program section of the Massachusetts State Police. The other voice you heard, my co-pilot on this, is Robin Reisman from UMass SAFE out at UMass Amherst, a grant-funded program out at UMass that takes all of our crash reports, plus organizations with other invested into crash data, reducing serious injuries and fatalities, puts it all together. I'm glad to have the UMass campus with us, the flagship university of the Commonwealth. So thank you, Robin. We're here today, simple purpose of when I got together with Robin about 6 months ago, this project was already in the works. Like I said, they take all the crash data that we put in from the side of the road and put it all together and use that for statistical analysis, causations, correlations, which all benefit everybody out there to the boots on the ground. And with some minor issues that we have is we can do our data better. The slide you're seeing right now is our first myth slide, in that we have to get rid of the myth that crash data is not just for the insurance companies. I've been doing this job for 23 years, and it boggles my mind when we have law enforcement officers who I've talked to through all walks of life who believe that the reason we write crash reports is for the insurance companies. It's our job to document everything that's happening. It's our job to find causation when we can. And the reason for that is right there on your screen. If you look at the top left corner on that targeting roadway improvement, if you've ever driven down Route 2 eastbound, past the Concord Rotary, past Walden Pond, we used to take a sharp 90-degree corner there. It's a location called Crosby Corner. If you're traveling it now and never saw before that, that was a huge problem intersection. That was a four-way intersection where we stopped Route 2 and allowed traffic to cross. I know the Concord Barracks was dealing with crashes on a daily basis. I know the town of Concord was dealing with those crashes. And by the information put into our systems, we determined that those crashes didn't need to be caused if we could reroute the road. And that multi-million-dollar project that you travel down now as a result of that. What that does not only makes traffic flow more freely, but as a traffic incident management instructor, if we can stop the crashes on the road, that eliminates boots on the ground. That takes the cops off the road, takes the EMTs off the road, it takes the firefighters off the road, and that way they're not setting themselves up to get hit by secondary crashes. If you look at the top right corner, sorry, we backed up. There we go. Grant funding. This is our grant funding month where we ask NHTSA for all of our money. Mass State Police is putting in about $3 million worth of requests for funding. And my data that comes onto those grants comes out of the crash analysis that these companies do, that UMass SAFE does and UMass DOT does. I was shocked when I looked up the information on the amount of crashes as a result to OUIs and found that number to be extremely low. So when I called Mass DOT to find out if I was looking at the wrong number, I was looking at the right number, but it was a problem with the input of information into the system. The numbers, I wish they were that low, but working with Mass DOT, we don't believe that they're low. And we identified a couple problems where we think those numbers, where that discrepancy comes from. And that bottom right corner on how we use this information, if we can go to the next slide. we're able to, with correct information into the system, we can direct law enforcement, we can direct Mass DOT to fix the problems. Through the information that you're seeing right now, you're seeing where, especially with the pedestrian crashes, Mass State Police, admittedly, we don't do a lot of pedestrian crashes, but the town of Cambridge does. The city of Cambridge had 8 fatal crashes last year. Only 2 of them were a result of motor vehicles. The rest were either motor vehicle versus pedestrian or motor vehicle versus cyclists. If Cambridge PD can look at information put into the system on where those crashes are occurring, they can either direct road improvements or they can direct law enforcement to reduce those numbers. So our main goal today here is Mass State Police, and I'm sure all of us are part of the Road to Zero campaign, where we're trying to reduce fatal crashes to 0 by the year 2030. How do we do that? By collecting the proper information and directing our enforcement and our improvements in those locations. So not just for insurance companies, but for all of us with a broader heading of why we need to create accurate information. Problem we have seen through the very beginning is, I remember when this new crash report came out 15, 20 years ago, I don't think in the Mass State Police, I'll throw us under the bus, I have really sat down for a training session on how to fill out a crash report. I think it was just understood on what we should be doing. Today, we start the process of fixing this. Through UMass Safe and what they've done with creating the manuals and the resources that you're going to see in the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we're going to direct people in the right locations, and we're going to fix some of the small things we can do today that will create more accurate reports in the future. So that's my introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who can bring us through more specifics on what we need to do.
Great, thanks so much, Lieutenant Sonia. We really appreciate having all your input on the project right from the beginning. So as Lieutenant Sonia said, I'm Robin Reisman, I'm from UMass Safe, and what I'd like to do is share with you the materials we created, as well as kind of how we created them and how we got the information that we got, and talk about how they can be used in the field. And as Lieutenant Sonia said, the idea is to improve the quality of the data as much as we can, so that we can use it to help prevent crashes. So there's 3 separate flyers that we created. As you can see on the screen, there's a supervisor's guide with the intent of supporting supervisors as they're reviewing crash reports before they go to the Registry of Motor Vehicles. And then there's 2 flyers that can be used by officers and troopers. One is on important crash report elements, and one is on crash narrative guidelines. And so what I'd like to do is just share with you more about what we did and how we got there. So next slide. So we did 2 pieces of work, really. One was looking at important crash elements and what fields were left empty or had invalid information often, and what we might do to prevent that. And the other, as I said, was creating crash narrative guidelines. So we began by talking to law enforcement about their experiences in reporting crashes and what were the challenges and what worked and what would make things easier for them. And then we spoke to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and we did some analysis on what fields were the most problematic. And these are the 15 fields that came up. So these are the coded fields on the crash report form that are left empty or have invalid information the most often. You may have heard of a Registry of Motor Vehicles project called Accepted with Warning. And so for these fields, they will accept the crash report even if information is missing on these fields, but they'll send some feedback back to the police department that they were accepted with warning. Now, I know there's a lot of reasons why these fields are left empty, and a lot of good reasons. And as we talked to officers, we learned a lot about that. So for example, if the driver and passenger after a crash are outside of their vehicle by the time you arrive, you don't know if they were wearing their seatbelts. And therefore, it's really difficult to complete that information. However, what the registry is asking for is that even if the response on the crash report is unknown or not applicable or other, that it still be filled out. So if you get to a scene and you don't know if the seatbelt was worn, we ask you to complete unknown. In other cases, we've heard from officers that they leave fields empty if the answer is no. So if a vehicle was not towed, we find that field is left empty a huge % of the time. And again, what the registry is asking is that field gets completed with a 99 or an unknown. If a passenger's airbag is not deployed and they were not ejected and they were not transported anywhere, this whole section of the crash report is often left blank. So these are the 15 fields that seem to be the most problematic on the crash report form, and the registry is asking that officers and troopers complete these fields, and that when supervisors are reviewing crash reports before they submit them to the registry, that they focus on these fields. And so one of the flyers that I showed earlier, and we'll talk about again in a couple minutes, goes over these fields. The second part of the project was looking at crash narratives and creating some guidelines for law enforcement on how to complete this section of the report. And when we talked to officers and supervisors, they basically said we've never been given any information on what to include in the narrative. So we thought it might be helpful to provide some guidance on that. And we created a sample narrative for what we felt should be included. We talked to lots of law enforcement as well as lots of data users, including the Registry of Motor Vehicles, about, does this make sense? And then we piloted these narrative guidelines with these police departments and got lots of feedback from them about what was working and what wasn't. So if you look at the next slide, as I said, there really hasn't been any guidance on what should be included in the crash narrative. And when we looked at crash narratives on a variety of crash reports, they were really different. They varied greatly from short to long, from including a lot of detail to very little detail and everything in between. So in the hopes of making the narrative easier and more concise, we developed this criteria. So the items under the green traffic light are the items that should be included in the narrative. And then the items under the yellow are ones that you can include if you want to include, but they're not necessary. Now, it's possible that individual departments will find that they want some of this information in the narrative. And then the information under the red traffic light is information that should not be included in the narrative. The biggest being personal identifying information. We've had lots of dialogue with law enforcement about what to do about this and lots of questions. But the registry has been really clear that, and the MassDOT Highway Department, that adding personal identifying information here makes it difficult to share crash reports with folks that need it because they have to redact all of this information. The other interesting thing that we learned from the registry is that when supplemental narratives are submitted to the registry doesn't receive them. So if you, instead of completing the narrative section on the crash report, you add an addendum that's a supplemental narrative, the registry doesn't receive that information. So this is our sense of what should be included in the narrative. As you know, the narrative is a place to describe what's happening prior, during, and after the report. And every crash is a little different. And so this is the place where officers can describe the unique events of the crash. And ideally, it's to capture information that's not in the coded fields. So the brief crash synopsis might include some coded information, but this is the place for you to add the caveats of the crash that might not be described earlier. So what we're asking is that these narrative guidelines be used for the first paragraph of the narrative. And then if your police department has a policy where you are required to add additional information, that could be the second paragraph. It's also possible that police departments, in looking at these narrative guidelines, will decide that that supplemental information that they've been asking for isn't necessary if the registry is not needing that information. But again, if additional information is needed, that should just go into the second paragraph. So we're hoping that these guidelines will make it easier for officers to complete this section. It's very concrete, give the basic crash synopsis, go into the less common characteristics, add additional location information, and anything else that's not in the coded fields. And then we're also hoping that this information will help supervisors as they're reviewing crash reports, because it will be very succinct and it will be in a specific order, and they can use this information to review things. So that, in a nutshell, is the basis of the project. And what we've done is we've provided this information. If you could go to the next slide. We've provided this information on our crash e-manual. And I think a lot of you know about the crash report e-manual and use it, but I just want to give a quick overview of it for some of you that don't. So this is an online resource. It's at masscrashreportmanual.com. And it's a place for people to look for, law enforcement basically, to look for any information that they might need for completing the crash report. And the biggest piece of that is the data dictionary. There's also a PDF version of this crash e-manual, and we've learned from a lot of departments that what they've done is they've printed out that PDF version of the manual, and they've left it at sites, computers where folks are completing crash reports, or put it in cruisers, or included it in the computer so that people can go and access the PDF. But you also can go to this website and look up information that you might see. And this next slide shows just a sample of what it looks like. So you can search for any crash report field and view detailed information about it. You also can gather information about how to fill out the location section and how to do the diagram. And these are the sections that we hear from officers are the most confusing parts of the crash report. So this is a place to get some guidance on those. And on the next slide, you'll see a sample of querying the data dictionary. So an officer can go in and query injury status, and this is what they'll find. It'll give instructions, it'll give a definition of this field, it'll give a rationale of why this field is important, and then it will describe all the different options. This is kind of an interesting one because the injury options have changed recently. So we used to talk about incapacitating injuries, and the registry is moving on now to instead suspected serious injury, suspected minor injury, etc. So on this site, you can see the definitions for all of those. It also shows some information from a crash data audit that was conducted actually by UMass Safe with a bunch of law enforcement, and what we found about how this particular field was completed and what the challenges were. And if you look at the next slide, this is just another example. So this is where an officer would search for the traffic way description and the different options. And one of the things we've learned from officers is this is one that's a little bit confusing. And so this gives you a chance to take a look at and make sure you're choosing the right option. So next slide. So these are, again, the guidelines that we showed at the beginning. So there are 3 documents, each of which can be downloaded on the Mass Crash Report Manual, just with a /guidelines. So one is a supervisor's guide. We're hoping that this information will support supervisors as they're reviewing crash reports. The second is the important crash report elements that we talked about. And the third is the narrative guidelines. And each of those second 2 are also included in the supervisor's guide. So we're asking officers and troopers to really focus on these 15 fields when they're completing a crash report, and including options like other, unknown, or not applicable if one of the field options you don't have enough information for. And then we're asking supervisors to use these deemed important fields as you're reviewing crash reports. So we're hoping that this, in fact, will make crash reporting a little bit easier because it's so concrete. And also that it will give Massachusetts information to plan programming, to fix roadways, to guide enforcement, to target overtime patrols, etc. So we're hoping that you'll download these tools. A special thank you to the folks on this list, the pilot town departments that helped us create these materials and tested them, to the folks at the registry and the folks at state police. We really appreciate all of your help. Again, these guidelines are available on the eCrash Report website, and we also have some print copies of those if you'd like those. And both Donna at the registry and us at UMass Safe relish feedback. So please feel free to contact us with anything. And thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.